The latest edition of Wine2Wine takes place in Verona on the 25th and 26th of November 2019. I am super honoured to have been invited to appear on a panel discussing podcasts, audience growth, education and social sustainability, which I hope to broadcast here at a later date. As part of my preparation for that talk, I put together a special deck that sets out all of the podcast equipment that I use to produce Interpreting Wine. To see that, and I hope get you started on your podcasting journey, just head to interpretingwine.com/kit. This series was recorded at this year's Wine2Wine in Verona and will feature interviews with the key organisers, as well as selected speakers, bringing the experience of this major digital event and allowing you to feel a part of proceedings no matter where in the world you are. Today's episode of the Wine2Wine series features Felicity Carter, Editor-in-Chief of Meininger's Wine Business International. Catching up at the Wine2Wine conference where we were both presenting, we hear her origin story and transition into her current role. We get an overview of Meininger's Wine Business International and its related wine competition. We discuss the idea that the future is voice, talk buying wine by voice, and Felicity looks ahead to 2020. Enjoy.
In 1999, I got a job writing brochures for a company called Cellar-Masters in Sydney, and they had a lot of in-house wine training, which was very good. But from that, I came to believe that I was an amazing expert in wine, and there wasn't much that the world could teach me. And then in 2001, September 11 happened, and I got really interested in foreign affairs. So I went back to university to do graduate studies in journalism, always intending to do sort of foreign affairs reporting, and I was hoping to be a war correspondent. But it turns out that when you're a mature age student and you don't speak Arabic or Russian, the jobs for war correspondents are quite few and far between. So I'd been doing some freelance writing, and I pitched a story about wine to The Age, which is a major metropolitan newspaper in Australia, and they bought it. And suddenly I was in a massive media field. And what happens is all the public relations people suddenly take notice of you and they wonder who you are. They actually rang The Age and they said, who is this person? And then you start getting invitations to wine events. And at that point it became abundantly clear that I didn't actually know very much about wine. So I started researching and reading. I'd go home at night and I would read up about wine, so I could pitch more stories to The Age and then ultimately to the Sydney Morning Herald. Once you do that, you're kind of in as a wine writer. But it was never my intention to be a wine writer. So I wrote about a lot of other things as well. I wrote about oil and gas. I wrote about science and medicine. I wrote about dogs. So. But then I saw a job interview for a job overseas for a 1-year contract for a properly trained journalist who knew something about wine. And since I'd always wanted to be a foreign correspondent and I wanted to work overseas, I put a application in, and that was 12 years ago. About 15 years ago, a number of European publications and even movie producers were moving into the English-speaking world. It was very trendy. And so what this spawned was a whole lot of terrible magazines that had sort of half French, half English and were unreadable in either language, and a whole lot of really awful European movies where the actors clearly didn't understand the English scripts that they were saying. But what my company did differently, what Meininger Verlag did, was they had the good sense to actually employ native English speakers. So I wasn't the first person who worked there. There was an American who lives in Germany who helped to set the magazine up, and they got Robert Joseph, who's English, to help them. And they really thought a lot about what the market needs. So it's a business publication, and they were like, well, what do business people in wine need to know? And in the early days, it was very, very academic. It was quite dry. But what happened was, so I came along in late 2007 just for the 1 year, and then the global financial crisis happened. And it's awful to say this, but it was actually really good for the magazine because suddenly everybody needed really good market data. And so we're a very German publishing house. Germans don't like self-promotion and are very uncomfortable with marketing. So we don't do most of the marketing that is usual for publications in the English-speaking world. So it was only sold by word of mouth, basically, and it grew. I was then offered a job as editor-in-chief, which I said yes. And every year I was like, well, I'll just stay 1 year. And then, 1 year turns into 2 years. But it's a very intellectually exciting magazine because we do a lot of we do a lot of normal wine reporting. We go into wine regions and so on. But because of the nature of what we do, what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain the world to people who export. So we try and break down the world. So if you want to go into, say, Denmark, we try and explain, how do you go into Denmark? Who are the people you talk to? What sort of price points do you need? What are they drinking in Denmark? So we give you a sort of how-to. But as a consequence of that, we ended up doing a lot of liaising with governments as well. So, I remember we went to Brussels to talk to the Minister of Agriculture about how they were, what the EU was planning to do about the wine sector. And so, although I wanted to go into sort of heavy reporting and foreign reporting, it actually offered me a way to do all of that. So I've reported from 22 countries in the last 10 years. And what I've learned from that is, don't think you can go into a foreign country and understand it. It's really difficult. You will never understand it. And so what we do is we have a team of anywhere between 15 and 30 correspondents around the world, and we try and use people who are in the market and who understand it to report on it, rather than people who do a press trip and they parachute in and parachute back out. So we try and explain the world from the point of view of standing in the place we're reporting on.
Yeah, expertly weaved together, and I think that's really given us a sense of, again, how the wine world can hook you in so many different ways, isn't it? It may be the food, it may be the geography, and it kind of gave you, I guess, the professional fulfillment that you were looking for right there at the start, and you managed to find that through wine. And I think it's just another way to show what a broad and varied career really that people can have in the wine world. I'm super curious then about Meininger's Wine Business International, because I'm a subscriber to the newsletter. I get that coming through. I know there's digital components. I know that there's print components, but I don't know exactly how they all sort of fit together. So I wonder if you just sort of zoom back from that as an entity and just let us know how does it kind of look in November 2019.
Okay, so we exist primarily as a print publication. We're bi-monthly, and it's a very high-quality journal, even down to the fact that the paper is very high quality, because the kind of information that we have is often evergreen information. We don't chase the news in the magazine. And so we know that a lot of libraries, for example, like to accumulate the magazine for their students. So it's a physical object that's kind of built to last. And we have three distinct audiences, and then there's a couple of others as well. So the first is we have C-suite people in big companies who read us, often to find out about a market they might be thinking about going into, or to look at what their competitors are doing, or to look at trends that are happening overseas. Then we have another group, which is MW students, who we've done some work with the Institute to look at what MW students need to get through their exams, and they're encouraged to subscribe to us. And then the third group is producers who know they need to export but aren't always sure about how they should do it. And so we try and put in there's quite a lot of really rigorous, hard market data. So on things like not just telling you about the market in South Korea, but actually identifying who the major buyers are in South Korea and how you should approach them and what sort of price points they're looking for. So that kind of information. We do know that most of our readers, because they're busy and they travel a lot, are most likely to read the physical copy on a train or in an airport. So my competitors are not the other trade magazines. My competitors are actually the free Wi-Fi at Starbucks and also the free copy of the Financial Times. So in every magazine, I try and put some stuff in that's just interesting and just something you would like to read anyway, just to stop people going and using the free Wi-Fi at Starbucks. That's my sort of honey trap that I do. And then we also have a smattering of people who are buyers in various countries who want to know about what trends are going on. So we've also got an online side, which we've beefed up a lot this year. We're putting a lot more resources into it. And of course, online is very different from print. It requires a very different approach. So there's a lot more opinion. There's a lot more sort of things that are interesting. There's a lot more news. There's a lot more of things which is much easier to read online. So there's that. And we do a newsletter once a week, provided I'm actually somewhere where I have internet, and we've got some other things planned as well. But we are part of a much bigger publishing house, and so there's other special projects that we get involved with as well that have nothing to do with this magazine necessarily. And the company I work for has a very major wine competition. And because we've got about 8 or 9 dedicated publications, which are just sort of wine and alcoholic beverages. And we've got this big competition. So we have a warehouse where every day there's just trucks and trucks and trucks of wine coming up, and we have warehouse staff who do nothing but sort out the samples and organise tastings and things like that. So there's a lot of tastings going on all the time.
I like that level of detail that you're talking about there, where you're talking about, your competition is the Wi-Fi in Starbucks and where people are listening. And, it naturally kind of takes me to podcasting. And, I would like to sort of bring that in a bit later into the conversation, because most people listen to podcasts when they're commuting or kind of doing something else on the move. But I'll be honest, one of the areas you mentioned there that I hadn't come across is this idea of the wine competition. And, really broad question. Just, take us inside of that. Is this something that has been going for a long time? Is this something new? Take us deep dive into the wine competition side of things.
Well, the wine competition was set up, I think it was around 20 years ago. It was before my time. I know we've done about 26 or 27 competitions. And I think I would be correct in saying it's the biggest in continental Europe. And so when it was started with the help of Robert Joseph, who's founded competitions all over the world. And in those days, the competition used to be what was called the OIV system. The Organisation of Wines and Vines from Paris has a very particular way of judging. So most European competitions use it, where you sit down and you sit in silence and the wine comes out and you fill out sheets. I don't know if you've ever done it. And anyway, it's an interesting system, and there was a lot of thought put into it. But no system of judging is perfect. But eventually, it became difficult. We needed a bit more flexibility, so we have a sort of modified OIV system where the judges know, for example, what the varietal is that they're judging, and the competition has grown so enormous that we now run it twice a year. So we have a spring tasting, we have an autumn tasting, and under OIV rules, you have to have people from around the world. So we have people from every major market and every wine producing country in the world. And I think we have about 300 judges. I can't quite remember. But so that takes place, and it's really intense. Judging wines, but it's a really good thing, because if you're a new wine producing country, one of the things that's most important for you is to get scores or medals. As much as everybody hates scores and medals, you actually need them for credibility if you're starting out. And so if you're in a competition like this, what it means is you see world trends, because you can start to see who's first hitting the export market. So at the moment, for example, there's a lot of ex-Soviet countries that are reorienting themselves towards Western markets, and not just the usual players like Moldova and Romania and Ukraine, but also much tinier players that we haven't seen before, like Serbia, are now making a big push into Western markets. So that's interesting in some of the Asian countries. And even what's really peculiar is even some of the, well, I shouldn't say peculiar, but it kind of is if you think about it. Some of the Middle Eastern countries are producing wine as well. So, and everybody wants a European tick of approval. So we see a lot of very interesting things. I have to emphasise, Meininger Verlag inside Europe is a really well-known, fairly large publishing house. It's a middle-sized publishing house, and when it comes to all the tasting, it's an enormous amount of work because we have so many magazines. So we have a tasting department, and all they do is organise tastings every day and organise the samples for the wine competition. It's an enormous effort. I think my boss has been talking about building a new facility just to handle it all.
Yeah, we were actually introduced, I think, over email more than a year ago, let's say. Neither of us knows the exact time, by mutual friend Dorley Moore, who I've interviewed and featured a couple of times on the podcast. And I remember so clearly now, so vividly, in her sort of way, we'd finished the interview and she sort of lit up again and she said, "Oh, I know somebody that you have to meet. I know somebody who recently told me the future is voice," and it ended up being yourself. So keep it nice and broad, I think. Could you, kind of unpick, I guess, that statement, because it is a fairly hefty statement, really, when you think about it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stand by that. So last year I did a really interesting thing. I went to the United States for a week-long trip through the big media in the US to look at their profitability models, to look at what they're doing. So we went and visited people like the Washington Post, we went to the New York Times, we went to National Public Radio, we went to National Geographic, we went to about 10 people of that calibre. And what I was really interested in is how many of the big organisations are now employing actors to work within them and to podcast different articles. Now, this has huge implications for the way you write, because the way that you comprehend things that you listen to are different to reading print on a page or reading print on a screen. So already it's having a big impact in the way that we construct texts. But one of the points that they all made, and I went to a presentation on this, is that we're moving into a voice-activated future. So I was in the States in November, and they said that by Christmas 2018, 50% of American households would have a smart speaker. In fact, they hit that number by the end of November. And this changes absolutely everything, because in the days when you used to have to handwrite, having clear handwriting was part of what it meant to be literate. And that was always the joke with doctors' handwriting, that they had terrible handwriting. The joke was they were an educated person that wrote badly. And then once we got keyboards, the whole idea about having to write clearly just fell by the wayside. It wasn't necessary any longer. Well, we're going back to a time when speaking clearly is going to be a form of literacy, because if you can't speak clearly, you won't make the world work. The doors won't open, the orders won't come. It's going to have enormous implications for the wine industry, for people, particularly in the German countries, who have wines that are very difficult to pronounce because people are going to struggle to order them. So what we're on the cusp of, I think, is a big change in literacy of the kind that we haven't seen really since the birth of the printing press. We're going to be moving back to the ancient world of having to speak to one another to make things happen, not simply to persuade each other, but to actually get anything to happen in the world. And that's going to be a really interesting time, I think. And podcasting is part of that. And part of the reason that podcasting has grown is actually to do with real estate prices, because very few people can now afford, especially younger people, can afford to live where they're working. So commutes all over the world have become much longer. People are spending much more time in trains. They're spending much more time in cars. And to block out the world, what they're doing is they're listening to podcasts. So everything at the moment is moving towards making podcasting. We're seeing the rise of the TED Talk, and we're seeing all the TED Talk spin-offs. And so we're seeing a new skill set emerging where you are now going to have to speak and present well, not simply because of a way of communicating, but to make a lot of important things work for you. One of the major things I've tried to do is to change the way that we write articles. And so I'm trying to make them more conversational without dumbing down the content. And that's really, really important. Mostly when you get sort of conversational level articles, what people almost automatically do is they dumb down the content. So I'm trying to find a way that we can deliver complex information, but in a way that if you heard it, because we do eventually want to move into podcasting as well, that if you heard it, you'd be able to comprehend it. I'm not sure I've got that right yet. It's a challenge for writers as well who've only ever worked in print, because it's a completely different way of working. But I'm thinking a lot about how we write things, particularly introductions, and how we communicate things in a way that we can move it gradually into the oral area. Having been around people who are visually challenged in my life, I know what a difference things like audiobooks and radio have made for them. It's been a lifeline to the world. And the other thing about listening to something is it's a much more intimate way to connect with whatever's being spoken about than reading text. I guess when you read a text, when you go into deep reading, you can sometimes forget the world around you, and you can create something in your own head, which listening to somebody's voice doesn't always let you do. But it's a very immediate and intimate connection with the rest of the world that's incredibly important. I mean, my mother was blind in her later years, and she completely relied on the radio to have a connection with the outside world. I think where the thing that we really need to think about is, in a global world, how do we stop the whole world turning into some form of dumbed down English because that's what everybody can pronounce? That's going to be our really big challenge, is how do we keep our diversity of language, and how do we keep all of our wonderful words, and how do we keep all of our hard to pronounce things when we're going to be pushed more and more towards a kind of international stripped down English? I think that's a really interesting question.
It's really, really refreshing to be with somebody and listen to somebody other than myself who's kind of banging that drum, because I 100% agree with what you've just been saying there. And so much, I think, is going to be around brand. I mean, I totally get your point around people listening more on their commutes. But I think there's arguably a wider point around podcasting, which is that it's a time saver, for those people even who are earning enough to be slap bang in the middle of Manhattan and, a short sort of commute or a short run or whatever it is from the office. What are they listening to when they're running? What are they listening to at the gym? And I think it can well reach the parts that other media can't, in a sense of, are you going to be running and reading a book or a magazine? Are you going to be watching a video safely? Probably not. And so I agree. I think that those almost from opposite ends of the spectrum, I think are pulling in the same direction. I think the thing that's really fascinating to me is that retail side of things, where you will be able to order a Merlot, or you'll be able to order a Cabernet Sauvignon, and Alexa, ship it. And what's going to be the brand that turns up? Is it going to be one that's actually paid to be the kind of sponsored top-ranked result there at the top? Or is, as I know, Gary Vaynerchuk, who is sort of quite vocal on this literally, is it going to be Amazon's own wine brand which turns up when you order like that, versus get me, this producer's, I don't want to name a particular producer, but to ask Alexa for a particular producer's Merlot is then going to give you a completely different result from just saying, I want a Merlot for under $20.
Okay, so there's a lot of things in that. First of all, I think it depends on who you're speaking to and who you're ordering from. I'm actually, this is really going to get me slammed, but I'm not a big believer in Amazon Wine. I think they've tried many times to sell wine, and apart from the regulatory issues, which haven't gone away, I also think wine has to be sold in a different way. Digital can be a real killer for wine. I've just come back from China, and people were talking about, when you put wine into digital channels, immediately you're up against price wars and things like that. And one of the things about Amazon is it relies on its partners to upload all of the data and to upload PDFs and to put it in the space. Most wineries actually really struggle to do that on their own websites, and they certainly struggle to do it on Amazon's website, and they struggle to do all the shipping that Amazon demands. And Amazon's not going to have lots of wine sitting in their warehouse. So I've always actually been a little bit cynical about whether Amazon is going to do this. Now, where Amazon will work and is working is already with big brands. And I think if you're in the market for big brands, whether you buy a private label from Amazon or whether you buy it from someone else probably doesn't bother you that much. When you're talking about fine wines, on the other hand, that's where it's going to be really interesting. And that's where I think there's an opportunity for specialist retailers to think more about how they activate with voice and how they get consumers past the difficulty of pronouncing some wines as well. I think that's going to be a really big hurdle for the wine industry and something that we should really think about. And I think particularly specialist retailers should think about that.
This is really going to be the last question from me. I think it's absolutely fantastic to have had this chance to speak with you, courtesy of being both here together at Wine2Wine. I'm going back to the UK tomorrow. I gather you'll soon be heading back to Germany, and I'd just like to leave it on the note of what is it that you're kind of looking forward to? What's going to be sitting on your desk when you get back? And looking forward, what are the things that you're looking forward to working on into the next year that we're nearly at now?
Well, I've got the magazine to send to print later this week, and I'm certainly looking forward to getting that done. And then I go into my quiet period, which is I start planning for next year. I think the thing that I'm really focused on, which is it feels increasingly urgent to me, is we need to talk about profitability in the wine trade. The margins are razor thin, and things are getting tougher. They're not going to get easier. We've got a generation coming who are less inclined to have anything to do with alcohol than previous generations. We've got a lot of wineries around the world where the owners are aging, so they're looking to exit the business and maybe sell. So we're going to see a lot of consolidation. And how do we, with the people that are left that maybe don't want to be really big or they're not going to be famous boutique, how do we make those people profitable? How do we keep people on the land? I think that's something that I feel really strongly and passionately about.
Thank you once again, Felicity. As I said, an absolute pleasure to meet somebody who believes, like I do, that the future is voice. And I can't wait to see the creative ways that you play with this idea. Do please see below for website and main social media handles for Meininger. And if our conversation has inspired you to want to try your hand at podcasting, please do visit interpretingwine.com/kit, that's KIT, for a detailed breakdown of all of the kit that I use to produce Interpreting Wine. Next time on the Wine2Wine series in episode 346, I'll be in conversation with another speaker at the conference. See you then.